So let me introduce Benjamin to you all. To my left is the Reverend Benjamin Liddell Reynolds. Do you say Liddell?
Liddell.
Liddell?
Liddell.
Benjamin Liddell Reynolds, a native of Colorado Springs. Benjamin has spent nearly 4 decades in active ministry. Were you a child evangelist or something? How does that work?
I started preaching when I was 14 years old.
Wow, you were a child evangelist.
Yes.
That's awesome. Benjamin believes that life is a series of calls and that we may have more than one calling over the course of our lives. He feels the purposes of his calling are yet ahead of him. Benjamin is currently employed at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston as Assistant Vice President of Student Services and Dean of Students. Benjamin serves as the transitional pastor for the historic First Church of the Brethren on Chicago's west side. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Communications from the University of Denver, a Master of Divinity from Iliff School of Theology in Denver, and is in the exam preparation phase of a PhD in theology from Chicago Theological Seminary. Benjamin has become established for his activism and organizing around issues of equality, access, and community dialogue, serving as director of the LGBTQ Religious Studies Center at Chicago Theological Seminary, Director of Faith Communities for the Illinois Unites for Marriage Equality campaign, and lead consultant for the Table to Action Project, bringing Chicago's diverse community of religious, academic, and moral leaders together for dialogue and collaboration to build a stronger ecumenical community in the city. Benjamin takes the position that, quote, race and sexuality and gender and class are co-constitutive in our life. However, over and over again, we find members of the community placing anti-racist work in conflict with the struggle for LGBTQ inclusion. Ordained American Baptist, Benjamin has standing in the United Church of Christ. Welcome, Benjamin.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you for allowing me to come. Thank Reverend Jeffrey for inviting me to come and to share what I believe is my take on the Black church or my experience with the African American church. And I'll use those terms interchangeably over the next few weeks, Black church, African American church, but they mean all the same thing. I want to just sort of go back to Jeffrey's introduction where he was talking about my having been in ministry for over 4 decades, and I mentioned that I began preaching my initial sermon at the age of 14. What is quite typical or has been quite typical in the Black church has been for that community to be able to identify the gifts and graces that one possesses for ministry and be able to allow them to use those gifts early on. And such was my case, being able to preach my initial sermon on my 14th birthday. Of course, I hadn't had the experience of preaching. I hadn't had the education that preachers have, but it was an opportunity to put me in the right trajectory towards the career that God has blessed me to have. And I've also been very blessed to not only preach that sermon in Colorado Springs at the Emmanuel Missionary Baptist Church, but some years later to go back and pastor that same congregation for almost 16 years. And so that is something that I'm very, very excited about because I am here today because of those folks who helped me to stay focused and to better understand who I am and the call to ministry that I have. I hope this will be conversational. I don't want to take up all the room talking. I hope that you'll be able to talk back and ask questions. Next week, I will provide you with handouts. I'm sure that Jeffrey will send them out to you earlier before our time to gather next Sunday, but also a book list. So there'll be additional reading in case you're interested, some of the concepts, ideas, philosophy behind the African American church I will share with you next week. And so this is a conversation and about a topic that I love, the Black church. I have an affinity for the Black church. And at the same time, I am very, very critical of the Black church for a number of reasons. I don't know if we'll get to that today, but I will certainly talk a little bit about some of the things that make it critical for me and make it very complicated. So when we say African American church or Black church, what bubbles up for you? What thoughts come to your mind?
Music.
Music! Any particular kind?
Happy and everybody participating and powerful.
All right, powerful, engaging music, excited, celebratory. What other thoughts about the Black church?
Long.
Long! Paul, does that mean you've been?
Rumors.
All right, other thoughts? Yes.
In a prior life, I took a youth group to the Baptist church down in Evanston. And
Second Baptist.
Second Baptist Church. And it was long, it was like 2 hours, but the time passed very quickly. We were so welcomed, the music was stunning, and it just felt like that was kind of the life for Sunday. Not entertainment, but the life, and you could really tell that people were very engaged in the 2 hours.
Others?
When I was in college in the last century, I went to a First Church of Deliverance on the south side. I don't know if it's even there anymore.
It is.
I felt that energy also, but one other thing was one of my friends had his arm around the girl he was sitting next to, and the usher came by. And what he was saying was, pay attention, nothing else except what's going on.
Interesting. So First Church of Deliverance is still on the south side of Chicago, and a very interesting thing about that, my younger brother and I, living in Colorado Springs, used to tune in every week to the First Church of Deliverance radio broadcast. That's how we got our church on, by listening to them on Sunday evenings.
I'd say very spirited.
Spirited, okay.
Particularly in the preaching and
Sort of embodied.
engaging everybody in it.
Interactive.
Okay, all right.
Uninhibited and joyful and really so much a part of what is going on. Has always been really interesting and something that I would like to be able to do, Sometimes I just want to do this. Say amen or And I come from a Presbyterian background, which they also refer to as the frozen chosen. So I love the participation, but that feeling of abandon, that just abandoning yourself to God and just letting it all flow through and feeling natural of who you are and where you're supposed to be. It just seems like, for me, that's what it is.
Yes, sir.
I want to say apocalyptic. Is that accurate?
Apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not sure if that's accurate or not.
I think that might be a good word. Others, please.
I've only seen on television that have not been to services, but ones I've seen, I noticed that, at least for the women, they dress up. It is you don't come shabby to church, you don't come casual to church. It is an occasion, and I think that shows great respect.
Yes.
And it's the highlight of the week, it seems to me.
Yes. Yes. Very true.
The community opportunity not only to worship together, but to spend time eating together and really joining one another with appreciating one another.
Absolutely. Other thoughts?
Lots. The history of the United States makes me think of the social progressivism and the resistance and the things since Reconstruction through Dr. King and beyond, the church has been an integral part of. But while it's, it makes me think about forward-looking progressive values, at the same time, a very conservative place to be. Growing up partially in, of all things, the Eastern Orthodox Church, I saw something of a kindred spirit because the old classical Greek Orthodox Church, a lot like I think the African American Church, God is to be experienced with all five of our senses. And it's not just listening to a word and nodding. It's standing up and it's singing loudly. It's shouting sometimes. And it's broadly spiritual.
Thank you. Anyone else? So if I said to you, we're going to a black church today, what would that mean?
I might get a hat.
You might get a hat. Yes, all right. So ladies wear crowns, hats. All right. So it is a place though, right? It's a place that you can go. But also it is not a destination, all right? Because I am in this predominantly white congregation now, in this building, right? But the black church is within me, right? I carry it with me wherever I go. So it's not just a place that you go, a building, but it is also the people themselves. So we carry the black church with us wherever we are. The other thing that I want to point out, which is so important, is not all black churches are the same. Thank you. They're monolithic. That is, we have black Presbyterian churches that may not be as expressive as Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago. Trinity is, of course, a part of the United Church of Christ, and the United Church of Christ is a predominantly white denomination, but Trinity UCC is the largest African American or the largest congregation within the United Church of Christ, and of course located on the south side of Chicago. So it's defined in many ways, in many aspects, but we're not all the same. All right, our music is not the same. Not all black churches dress the same. All right, but when I think about the black church, I do think about the church that I grew up in, Emmanuel Missionary Baptist Church, where we dressed up to go to church. That was very important. In fact, my parents, I grew up in a poor family. My father was a barber in his own business. My mother was a homemaker. I had 6 siblings. And my parents always bought us school clothes and church clothes. They were not the same. What you wore to school, you could not wear to church. And when you came home from church, my parents were very instructive. Take off your church shoes and your church pants or whatever, and now you can play. But you couldn't do that in your church clothes, because the clothing itself was sacred. It was just as sacred as worship itself. All right. And that all of that has history, because on Sunday, when black people went to church in the antebellum South, they wore the best clothes that they had, because it was an event. It was something special that they were getting ready to do, to be a part of, and they believed that they were going to meet God. They were going there for a purpose, for a very specific purpose. In addition to black churches not all being the same, I think our struggles are not only external, for fighting the forces of injustice and oppression, etc., but the forces there's a struggle that is also external. That is, the black church is divided about what it believes. So you may go to this black church and it may be more revivalistic piety, and the church across the street may be more of a protest church. And the way that sort of plays out is in not only the worship and the liturgy, but also in the sermon. So a sermon in a very revivalistic piety church is going to be focused on individual salvation and being saved and thinking about heaven, as opposed to thinking about what's happening going on here on earth in our communities. And a church that is more focused on protests will have to do with those things, fighting those struggles that exist in our society. All right. And then there are combinations of churches that have both of these things sort of going on. So it's all kind of different, and it's not one thing. Now, this congregation is about to join and be a part of, in a relationship, in a friendship with another congregation. Tell me about that experience, if you know about that experience. Have you worshiped there yet?
Come on, Gregory.
Yes, we have.
You worshiped there. So tell me what that was like.
Well, it was emotional. We wanted to meet as many friends as we could. We wanted to soak it all up. We wanted to go in mentally and spiritually just taking notes, but conscious not to show that we're going to come across as, too different or condescending. This white liberal guilt, which is just a cliche. We have to be careful and just let's talk about God together. And instead of thinking that these two different communities from the north side and the south side were going to get together, we were crying and embracing each other and singing loudly together, saying, this is the one community. So it was unforgettable. Mm-hmm. And we don't know where it's going. Mm-hmm. Okay. And we love that we don't know where it's going. We're just going to see where God might lead us.
Okay. Any other reflections from your time with the congregation on the south side?
I think Greg's the only Christian who was there, right?
Oh,
in the room right now?
It's just beginning.
It's beginning, yes.
Yeah,
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, but Pastor Lawrence preached here last Sunday.
Okay. And what was that like?
Fun.
Wow.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a combination. I mean, we actually got out of our seats a couple of times. Very uncomfortable. And the black community that was here, were doing the amens and following, expressing themselves, and it was like, are they supposed to be doing that? It's like anything that you're not used to. It was a little uncomfortable. At the same time, I agree with Gregory. It was joyous. It was really lovely to have a much greater attendance of black people in the church. It was lovely. Yeah.
So what are these differences that exist between an African American church and a white church? I mean, just things that you can readily access that are different. Well, I think some of it we've named, that you could be in a black church and people are very expressive. All right. What other things that you can think of are different?
Well, again, I would reiterate, most of us have not been down there, and it's really just getting started in only a small group of which Greg was a part, actually went down there. But the ministers have been back and forth several times, and there've been a lot of jokes that in the black church, people follow the minister. And up here, that ain't gonna happen.
Very true,
Yeah.
right? Black congregations, the pastor generally can get the people to go anywhere. If they were going to Louisiana, there would be a group that would follow, right? What other identifiable? What about the worship design itself? I mean, you may not have experienced it yet, but what Greg, maybe you can think about just the design itself
Of the service itself?
Yes.
Yes, it was longer than ours.
Okay. How much longer?
It
Yours
was almost twice as long.
Okay. Your service lasts what, an hour?
Yeah, we stick to 60 minutes.
One Lord, one faith, one baptism, 1 hour. St. Paul said that.
So you know, I'm a 1 hour person as well. I need to be in church 1 hour. That's enough.
Well, Bethel Baptist, it
Okay.
began and followed through and ended with music. There was a modern gospel band. I think it was a quartet, and different singers coming up, and the choir director was the lead, and he had a bunch of background singers. And by 10 minutes into it, we were all trying to sing along as much as we can. It was a call and repeat choruses over and over.
Yeah.
A lot of that.
Yeah.
And then, and it didn't matter what you were doing. Stand up, walk around, little kids dancing all over the place. It was joy. There was nothing to stop you from doing what was in your heart.
Okay.
And then there was a sermon, and then back to a lot of music. And just, it was there for everybody. And I thought of the similarities too, striking to look for and find a lot of similarities.
Okay.
There's a downstairs room with a huge screen TV for people who were staying at their cafe, or just maybe couldn't get up there as easily up the stairs to watch what was happening upstairs on a screen.
Mm-hmm.
So, very inclusive.
Okay. So in terms of the order of service and the music, did you have a sense that it was ever going to end? I mean, I asked Jeffrey to see the bulletin. So I saw the bulletin, and I could tell that at some point worship here is going to end, right?
That was a big difference.
That's a big difference.
Yes, compared to our program where you know when it's going to end. You didn't.
Yeah.
At Bethel, you didn't know when it was.
Was there a program? I mean, was there a paper?
Good question.
Actually, there was. I didn't have one in front of me. It didn't seem to matter, but
it didn't matter.
No, I don't think there was a program saying, "All right, these are the songs. This is the last one," or anything like that.
So the church that I pastored in Colorado Springs, parishioners, as they gathered, they would be given what would appear to be just a one-page sort of well-done bulletin. I had announcements on one side, the other side had a title of the sermon, maybe just a few little things about what they could expect in the sermon itself. But there was no order of service. Now the worship leaders, whoever was leading worship, had a worship script. And that was important for us because our church was a church that we grew from 125 to 2,500 with 3 different services. And so in that case, the services had to be timed. And in that way, each of them lasted 90 minutes and we could time them. Now, in the black church, even when things are timed, oftentimes you'll hear someone say, well, the Holy Spirit had its way. So that sort of signals the fact that it could go longer or did go longer than we intended it to. Now, I don't believe that because I believe the Holy Spirit can help us to be in the program.
How did people know what hymns and when to sing?
They were directed. by the worship leader.
We're now going to sing.
We're going to sing together.
Yeah,
Yes.
number.
Yes. Yes. So it's, you know, sometimes a bulletin is helpful in the black church, and other times it really doesn't have any significance. What other things might be identified as different or the same?
In my black churches, they have prayer topics that they pray about, that the congregational members talk about, or they present it and they all pray about it. It's not like we're here, we have, after we've done everything, the pastor prays over everything, and he very kind of inclusive, but there everybody talks and pray.
Yes.
So that can elongate.
Okay, yeah. So that's like an altar call where folks actually come together?
Altar call.
Okay, but just people
have the worship.
Okay.
You know, there's praise and worship, and people pray about their needs.
Okay.
know. Just like we make announcements, we pray about for people who are sick, who are doing this. But here, you know, somebody, just like you said, the Holy Spirit said, I sense that somebody is sick, let's pray for them.
Sure.
Somebody's going to do something, let's pray for them.
Yeah, so you don't know what's going to happen because you don't know what the need is going to be, and the congregation is going to help to fill that need. Thank you for sharing that. Greg, you talked about the music with what you perceived as a band. I actually took a moment to look up the Bethel Church on the South Side and look at one of the videos, and I noticed that they had a praise team, because that's a big thing, praise and worship team who sort of leads the music, and there's a band and there's singing, gets the congregation singing, usually very repetitive music. So even if you don't know the music, if you don't have a hymnal, you'd be able to sort of come alongside and learn how to sing those songs. So why is all of this even important? And how did it come to be? How all of a sudden was there a black church? Where does it come from?
You need to know a little history, first of all, that this congregation did this same kind of interchange many years ago with Friendship Baptist Church. And Reverend Paul Allen was here at the time, and the other pastor. And one of the things I remember distinctly was the two of them talking to each other on the pulpit, and the white pastor saying, "How can you preach when there's all that noise out there, the amens and things like that?" And the black pastor responding, why would you preach if you don't know they're awake?
What's your name? Thank you for that.
Jan should know she's an ordained UCC pastor too.
Oh, okay.
It's preaching thing.
Yeah. Okay, all right, very good, very good. So where does it come from?
Where does what come from?
The black church. How did the black church start?
Well,
I don't know.
Let Jay ask.
weren't necessarily allowed in the other churches.
Segregation.
Okay, so segregation's a part of that. This need to be together. But even before then, before it was even called the black church, do you know what it was called before that? The invisible institution. And the invisible institution was in the antebellum South, when black folks were owned by slave masters, and they felt a need to gather, to be one with each other for a religious tradition, for worship. They would gather around the brush harbor, or what we call the hush harbor, because their master didn't know what was going on. But they would gather around the brush harbor, and that's how where they were able to sort of take what had been introduced to them as Christianity and transform that so that it was useful for them. So they weren't taught Christianity. They took Christianity and made it serve what it needed to serve to meet their peculiar need here in the United States of America. And so that's how the black church really has its impetus from those early times in slavery. Yes.
Were they allowed, did they have Sundays off? Were they allowed to gather, or was it in secret when you say invisible?
There were slaves who did have Sundays off, and they were allowed to gather. But in the middle of the week, they weren't necessarily allowed to gather, but they would steal away. In fact, that was one of the songs that they sang. Steal away signaled that we're getting ready to go and gather. Steal away, steal away, steal away, steal away home.
Well, I kind of remember reading a book to my children, a real book, and I remember them talking about this invisible institution. And I don't know, but if they could, I think they also sang in the fields together.
Absolutely, absolutely. In the field they would sing, and occasionally a master might become a little bit concerned about their singing and make them stop.
Right.
Or if they began to pray in the field, the master would make them stop because the master felt as if they might be praying on him or her.
I thought that the original old Southern churches had balconies and that the slaves were almost ordered to church to be in the balcony and listen to the service.
Yeah, so that's a part of the tradition as well. They could go and be in the balcony. And I was in Kentucky recently and had an opportunity to go into one of those churches where they would actually put a ladder up so the slaves could go into the balcony and then remove it so they wouldn't be able to escape during the worship. Yeah, so they would do that. But for them, that wasn't worship, right? They needed their worship. They wanted to be able to commune with each other. And that's kind of how we have this sort of siloing of the black church.
My understanding of some of the music is it may have a double meaning. For instance, shall we gather at the river? Is this, we're going over and we're going to go to heaven. But it also means we're going to meet at the Ohio River.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Communicating through music, which is why someone said it, music is so important for the black church because it signals so much about the spirituality of a congregation.
And the reality.
And the reality, yeah. Yeah. So you get into you go to a worship in a black church, and the music, the selection of the music it's always pointing to something. It points to something. Something is happening. Now, so this is the first Sunday in Advent. Well, in the black church, we don't necessarily think about Advent, right? But a person like myself who preaches in a congregation that is multicultural, we're doing Advent. We do Advent every year. And as important as it is to lift up Advent, at the same time, we're going to lift up Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King is a very important component to the First Church of the Brethren on the West Side because when he did civil rights work in Chicago, he had an office in that building. That's why it's the historic First Church of the Brethren. And so we'll also talk about Dr. King and some of his complicatedness, which will help us to think about Advent as a time to be ready. We'll ask the question about what does it mean to be ready, to prepare for the return of Christ, or to prepare for Christ's coming, whether that is the coming through Christmas or the coming of the second coming. And so each Sunday we'll build upon some issue or some personality that relates to struggles in the black community. All right, even though it's Advent. So another occasion in this congregation, I'm sure you have a Christmas Eve service.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Two of them.
Two! All right. So the black church typically will not have a Christmas Eve service or a Christmas Day service. What we'll have is a watch meeting service. A watch meeting service. And that service is held on the last day of the year. So on December 31st, that service will begin typically 10 o'clock and we'll be in worship till 12:01. So it's a way to watch and bring in the new year. Also on Thanksgiving Day, do you all have a worship on Thanksgiving Day? No worship on Thanksgiving Day? A lot of black churches will have a worship on Thanksgiving Day. In terms of liturgical calendar, a lot of congregations follow the liturgical calendar. So this is Advent and the ordinary times, and not necessarily the case in the Black church. Or the lectionary text. Does this congregation follow lectionary text? Okay. All right, I follow lectionary text too. A Black preacher may say, on some occasions, I allow the Lord to lead me to preach whatever. So whatever's going on in the world, that's what I'm gonna preach about, right? Well, I do that too, except I use the lectionary text to guide those sermons. So I try to think about the sermons that are part of the lectionary and how they lend themselves to some of the situations that are going on in the world. One other thing that have you noticed that is different about your church and the Black church? Particularly around the sermon.
Is the sermon that I was at Bethel just a couple of weeks ago. Sorry, I'm forgetting exactly the theme, what the sermon was, but the sense of community was everywhere. This is where people, it's a huge part of their lives.
Yes.
You know, it's a big part of the community, and they took us right after the service across the street to their community center and showed us the basketball court and the after-school programs, rooms. It was all about kids and job training programs, a building 4 times the size of the church itself. And it's a big part of their day, their week, their lives.
So they build community around the church. For Black communities, the church is probably the most important institution. And that is because Black people feel that they own their church. It's the one thing in the world that they can say, we own this church.
More than their schools or
their
village
schools,
halls.
yeah, all of those things. The Black church becomes property.
Can I ask this question now? Because, in a lot of the white Protestant churches, the population is dwindling. Do you see that in the Black churches as well?
I was about to go there. Yeah, so I think there is a shift in the numbers of particularly younger folks who go to church, who either have not connected to some of the history of our churches, or the churches are not necessarily meeting their needs. And so you have millennials, Gen Xers, Gen Zers who are thinking about starting their own kinds of church. Those congregations are vastly different from a church that I may have grown up in. And that is, so we talked about the dress. They go to church just the way they would go to school, or how they would go wherever they would go. And that is not to be critical of them, because I think that these congregations speak to a generation that still needs them, but their music is different. It may not necessarily be connected to some of the more traditional music. I was talking to a group of students at Garrett, and they were telling me how they absolutely can't stand an organ. I can't imagine being in church without an organ. In fact, when I walked into the building today, I felt like I was in heaven, because the organist was practicing on the organ. Because that's a very important part for me of worship, whether Black or white worship is a very important part. It lets me know you have arrived into a very sacred place. But the decline is there. The church I serve on the west side, you're hard pressed to find anyone under 50 in the building. Occasionally a woman will bring her grandchildren. So it's a very sad kind of narrative. And occasionally when I'm out on the street and I'll just ask somebody about, had you ever thought about coming to church here? And they'll say, I didn't even know that was a church.
A friend of mine loves to come to church here because it's only an hour. She said she does not have time. She's Black. She said, I don't have time for a 3-hour service. So I think that's a very real.
It is real, right?
I think for all churches that's a real issue, but.
And then church life competes with so many other things, right? Especially if you're a parent with young kids who are involved in a lot of school activities, extracurricular things. It makes it very difficult to think about getting up on Sunday morning and coming to church. This is from a preacher even, but it's hard to think about it, right? Show up at church, and then spend all day there, right? 3 hours is a long time to spend in church.
And speaking to what you just said, the sports groups have meets on Sunday morning.
Yes.
Part of the reason that here's the kid who wants to be in sports and stuff like that, and the community isn't supporting the churches. They're hauling the kids off to whatever competition, and
Yes.
you've got to be there, otherwise you can't be in the team. And what's the poor parent going to do if they want to not deprive the children of this activity, which is for the most part healthy, go check out your leader. And that's another thought that society has handed the church.
Well, and I think that it points to the trend of our needing each other, black church, white church, needing each other, right? Because we're all struggling with some of these same kinds of issues. And what does it mean now for us to come together and really think about community in different ways? As I read biblical texts, it always talks about God doing a new thing, even though you've done this before. But what's inside this new thing that God is offering for us as people of God, whether black church or white church?
I just have a different question. Is the black church part, is there a national or international organization like the Presbyterians have, that this church is an independent church?
Mm-hmm.
Are the black churches, you said they're very different, some are progressive and some are more piety.
So there are, I think there are 8 major Protestant denominations, but there are more. And so when you talk about governing bodies, I think about the Baptist church I grew up in, which was aligned with the National Baptist Churches USA 8,000 member convention. And that's for Baptist. National Baptists, or as my daddy would say, Negro Baptists. That's what we were called. And then there's, of course, black churches who are part of the American Baptists. But there's African Methodist Episcopal, Church of God in Christ, Holiness, the United Methodist Church. So there's just different denominations themselves that constitute the black church. Seventh-day Adventist, all brands, and that's why this whole idea of us being one and the same makes it very difficult to sort of understand. It's just one place because we're all so very different.
It seems to me sometimes when you travel through the city, you see what appears to me to be a very small space that has something church. And is that more of an independent church? I mean,
Perhaps. Particularly when you think about storefront churches. That means like in a shopping mall, you might see a church in the middle of that. Those congregations typically are very independent.
so then are there, like you preached your first sermon when you were 14 in this comfortable environment in which you were growing up. Do black churches search for their preachers through Garrett Seminary? I mean,
they do. They absolutely do. Yes, I mean, sort of denominationally, right?
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
for example, if we were to think about Trinity United Church of Christ, if they were seeking a pastor, they probably would come to the United Church of Christ and get a list of the resumes, or get some of those resumes to get. The process is typically the same. Now, having said that, a lot of this is autonomous, right? So Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago, pastored for many years, founded by the Reverend Dr. Clay Evans, who died day before yesterday. That's a powerful influence in terms of black church, regardless of the denomination. But before he died, 20 years ago, he selected the person, he hand-selected the person who would take his place. All right, and then he retired, and that person, Pastor Charles Jenkins, took over for him, leading the Fellowship Church. So it just sort of depends. You'll see a lot of churches now in black communities where a pastor will tap someone on the shoulder and identify them as the next leader of that congregation.
That probably wouldn't work here.
Yeah, I probably would.
Wait, excuse me a minute.
Jess and
Maybe a too broad a question to ask specifically, but since some of those churches are independent and so on, what role does technology play in spreading the word and supporting a congregation, if at all?
Did you all hear that?
No.
What role does technology play in supporting the word and the working with the congregation?
And I would say that even in a small church context, if they have someone who is good with IT and social media, the support can be there. So if they have, someone who can record, as I'm being recorded right now, a service and make it seem like, it's larger than it is and get folks to support it, I think it can be supported in that way. So it becomes a matter of how much knowledge a particular congregation may have about technology itself and how that technology can be used to advance the cause of the congregation. Vince?
No, I was just going to say, like in a lot of traditions in black churches, that multiple generations, like a pastor and then his son would take over the church after that.
Absolutely.
And when I hear this discussion, I think black churches, I generally think of the South and maybe some of the northern towns. I don't think about West or Seattle, where my husband's from, or Los Angeles, where there are plenty of black people. And I don't think of that, and it could be my lack of knowledge, but I really think this is kind of tied to, or at least initially tied to place.
I would say not so much. Just because I think wherever there are black people, there is bound to be a black church somewhere there.
Well, I think but is it the same traditions, the same feeling, the same gospel, the same music, that kind of thing?
I think so, or at least some interpretation of that. So a church that is further away from the South or from, out further west, their interpretation of a gospel song may be vastly different from a congregation that worships here in Chicago.
But you still think the essence is
Absolutely,
the same.
absolutely.
And you, thanks for throwing out this idea of what's this new thing? Wow, that's a good thing to ponder and talk about a lot. Do you see maybe something that, like the theme of this, trying to find what we have in common rather than what separates us?
Absolutely.
Maybe the American church, or maybe just United States mainline Protestant churches can work together and say, we've got the same issues as far as younger people and millennials, how to share the same message to speak to these. We all hear about it, millennials who say they're very spiritual but they're not religious, so they just do their own thing. Well, how can the white church and the black church together, alter the message? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that is something that we should definitely begin to think seriously about.
Yeah.
I know that we're very close to time. Are we not? No?
Yeah, about 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes, yeah. So, I think that we have to think seriously about how do we work together, and particularly because younger generations seem to work well together.
Organized.
They work well together. And so how does the church then begin to understand a scripture that says, "And a child shall lead them." You know, beginning to sort of think in that way.
So we have 5 minutes. I'm curious, how do your black parishioners perceive the white churches?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, I don't know that I would be someone who could answer that question. I have a partner, right? So he is a member of an apostolic church on the south side of Chicago, very large apostolic church. I'm not even sure what that means, but I mean, I've been there, and what I will say, I've been there, and he's also worshiped with me. So my church is not, the church where I worship is not necessarily, I mean, it's, you know, so our musician's white, right? I'm black preacher, and so we have to work very hard to keep balance, right? So I think in some cases, when my partner has come to worship, he probably perceives our music as needing some help, needing a drum or something.
Boring.
Yeah, I think that he does. And when I've gone to his church, you know, I've experienced it as jubilant, and you know, but I also look around and wonder, do we know what it is we're rejoicing about, and what are we rejoicing about? So I mean, I don't know what others think. I know that for me, I need both, right? There are spaces I need to be in where I can be charismatic, you know, and clap my hands and say amen. But then there are other spaces where I want to be in where I can hear and apply. And again, I mentioned the organ. Most black churches may not have a pipe organ, but they've got a Hammond B3. Anybody know what that is? Yeah.
You got rid of it.
You got rid of it.
And in 1828, an organ was built in Paul Simon's brother's church, and I was the organist, helping to restore that old organ when we got rid of the Hammond.
That's Senator Paul Simon, not the singer.
I helped restore that thing.
You got rid of it, huh? So you're the organist that was on the organ this morning?
Oh no, that was Jill Hunt.
Okay.
Lois Eve is a keyboardist. Yeah, and voice teacher.
Okay. Right.
We're almost at the end of our time. Benjamin will be back with us next week, and for a little bit more exploration of this important topic. And we really appreciate your presence with us.
Very glad to be here.
And